Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Graham Fox, je suis le président de l'Institut de recherche en politique publique. Un grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici ce matin avec vous pour une conférence sur des enjeux que je trouve absolument essentiels à l'avenir de notre pays. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to collaborate with the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada on what I think will be a really important conference as we get into the pre-election silly season in Ottawa. It was a distinct pleasure to work with Daniel and his team, so I too want to thank everyone who contributed to gathering us all here for the next 2 days. I want to thank our sponsors as well for making this conference possible, and want to thank all of you as well for the contributions that you're about to make for the discussion. We've got a terrific program set up for over the next 2 days, but you will see the emphasis for each one of the panels really will be on exchanges with the room. We've asked all of our panelists to keep their opening remarks to about 7 minutes. We'll see how well we do on that front, but I am quite strict in that regard, because we really want to hear from you as well on how you think some of these dynamics will impact the policy landscape and the political landscape. A little known fact about the IRPP, we are actually the product of a commitment that the first Prime Minister Trudeau made in his speech from the throne in 1968, that there ought to be somewhere in the country an organization that is charged with the conduct of research on issues that are important to Canadians and their governments, but without any ties to a particular level of government, political party, or political ideology. In 1972, therefore, the IRPP opened its doors, and that really has been our mission for the last 46 years, de poursuivre des recherches, de s'engager avec le milieu académique et de bâtir des ponts entre ce qui se fait de mieux dans les environnements universitaires et les décideurs, que ce soit de la fonction publique ou les élus, pour créer des occasions d'échange sur les grands enjeux de politique publique. As some of you may know, a year ago, the Government of Canada decided to help us out a little bit more by providing a new grant to the IRPP endowment, but specifically geared toward creating what we're calling a Centre of Excellence on the Canadian Federation. As we were looking around the country a few short years ago, one of the things that really struck us as important is to renew our efforts to understand the dynamics that fuel and underpin our country, and to really focus on the plumbing of federal arrangements, of public attitudes toward national institutions and democratic institutions. And we were delighted that the Government of Canada decided to provide this extra funding for the IRPP to create that centre. It is very much our hope that the centre will be a convener and a convener and a broadcaster for the excellent work that is being done by people in this room and beyond to understand and strengthen the federal ties that bind. Alors, ça a été une décision tout à fait naturelle pour nous quand on a eu l'invitation de Daniel et de son équipe de s'allier à eux pour appuyer cet événement-là. C'était quelque chose qu'on trouvait absolument essentiel. Et j'en profite aussi pour annoncer qu'à partir du 1er avril, starting April 1st, we will be launching our search for the executive director of the center to join the IRPP team and lead that research effort for us. And so we hope that at least a few of you in the room will be interested. I'm not poaching McGill's excellent teaching staff, but we do hope that there will be a lot of interest in joining my colleague Leslie Seidel, my colleague Jennifer Ditchburn, and the rest of the IRPP team for what I think will be an important contribution to public debate. In terms of our first panel today, one of the themes of this conference is how provincial dynamics, both from the point of view of public policy and politics, might affect the federal landscape as we move into the pre-election season. And in preparing for this conference, I couldn't help but think back about a decade ago when Prime Minister Harper was preparing to go back to the people to secure a second mandate on the strength of his so-called 5 priorities that had led to his initial election in 2006. And I don't think it's a coincidence that of the 5 priorities, the only box he couldn't tick on that report card was on the wait times guarantees for healthcare, and it was the only one of the 5 that required meaningful federal-provincial collaboration. So the fact that that was left undone, I don't think is a coincidence or an accident. When you think forward to what Monsieur Trudeau is facing this year in trying to go back to the people, it's hard to imagine, it's hard to identify a single meaningful policy issue that his government has tried to tackle that doesn't have a meaningful intergovernmental dynamic, intergovernmental perspective. And so I think what we're seeing after a decade of attempts at disentanglement is now an era of managing interdependence between our tiers of government. And to help us out with these issues this morning, I'm delighted to have with me on stage Jean-François Daoust, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship and here at McGill. Melanie Thomas, Associate Professor, University of Calgary in the Department of Political Science. Peter Graefe, Associate Professor at McMaster, also in the Department of Political Science. And Richard Johnson, Professor at the University of British Columbia, Political Science. So I've asked everyone to focus their remarks on the provincial jurisdiction that they know best, that they study most, and then extrapolate in terms of what that might mean for the broader country. Mais je m'attends à ce que vous ayez, vous aussi, des questions pour notre panel. Alors, je vous invite tout de suite à préparer vos questions. J'en ai quelques-unes, bien sûr, mais j'espère qu'on va pouvoir vous entendre sur ces grands enjeux-là. Et je note au passage qu'il y a un micro à l'arrière de la salle que je vous invite à utiliser. Et pour nos amis qui pourraient se joindre à nous par diffusion web ou diffusion télévisuelle, je vous inviterai à vous présenter avant de poser votre question et de le faire dans la langue officielle de votre choix, et on va assurer une interprétation simultanée à partir de la scène. Alors, sans plus tarder, j'inviterai Jean-François Daoust à partager ses premières idées. C'est comme tu veux.
All right. So what if am I too loud? This is okay? Okay. So my opening remarks will be in French, but I will switch to English for the discussion. But first, I want to thank the organization. This is a great event, it is an honor to kick off this 2019 edition, as I think we are the very first panel of this year's edition. Moreover, this panel on provincial politics will get us all in the mood to be overwhelmed by tons of news about the Quebec federal budget, which will be announced later today. It will be the very first budget of François Legault's newly elected government. Et je débuterai justement à vous parler de l'élection de ce gouvernement lors de la dernière élection provinciale québécoise en 2018, octobre 2018. Cette élection est historique de point de vue objectif parce qu'elle a mis fin au bipartisme québécois qui, depuis 1970, on alternait entre le PLQ et le PQ. Est-ce que ça va durer dans le temps? Ça, l'histoire nous le dira, mais il y a quand même eu une cassure, une brisure qui s'est faite depuis près de 50 ans. C'est donc la première fois que les électeurs, depuis près de 50 ans, ont élu un gouvernement qui se revendique ce que j'appellerais une troisième voie. Parce que d'autres aussi, ce n'est pas une innovation. Une troisième voie, celle de l'autonomisme. Donc, c'est un gouvernement qui, de facto, est fédéraliste, mais qui ne se dit pas souverainiste, évidemment, se dit nationaliste, et on peut le qualifier d'autonomiste. Pour l'instant, ça semble être une véritable coalition. Son électorat est composé de plus du tiers de gens qui voteraient oui si un référendum avait lieu demain matin. Donc, pour l'instant, ce gouvernement porte bien son nom de parti, c'est-à-dire une coalition. Donc, cette approche, l'autonomisme, n'est pas récente. L'ADQ ou même le Parti conservateur du Québec pouvait s'en revendiquer, mais je trouvais qu'aujourd'hui, cette approche était particulièrement intéressante à analyser en termes de dynamique interprovinciale, en termes de relations intergouvernementales, pour deux raisons en particulier. Premièrement, cette approche-là, l'autonomisme, fait en sorte que François Legault ne peut pas aller négocier avec le fédéral et sortir d'une négociation en disant « Voilà, vous voyez que la fédération nous dessert et nous serions mieux si nous étions indépendants, contrairement à ce que peut faire un gouvernement souverainiste. Et donc, on voit mal comment cette approche-là peut faire en sorte que François Legault pourrait aller chercher plus de concessions du fédéral qu'un gouvernement clairement fédéraliste, parce qu'il ne peut pas se permettre de dire voilà, nous serions mieux si nous étions indépendants. Mais, j'en viens à mon deuxième point, ce gouvernement se distingue quand même de façon assez nette du Parti libéral du Québec, qui a gouverné évidemment pendant plusieurs années, durant les 50 dernières années. Par exemple, en matière d'immigration, premièrement, le nationalisme de la CAQ se distingue de façon très nette du Parti libéral. Et donc, ça se traduit par certaines mesures, notamment en matière d'immigration, qui requièrent de négocier avec le fédéral. Pourquoi? Parce que le fédéral a une partie des pouvoirs avec le regroupement familial et les réfugiés. Donc, il y a besoin de négocier avec le gouvernement fédéral. Et en campagne électorale, François Legault n'a jamais vraiment répondu à la question, pourtant toute simple, qu'allez-vous faire quand Ottawa vous dira non? Cette question est toute simple, mais on n'a jamais eu vraiment de réponse. Et là, maintenant qu'il est élu, on a vu un début de réponse, mais il n'a jamais vraiment répondu de façon très claire en campagne. D'ailleurs, un des débuts de la réponse, on l'a appris hier, alors qu'il semble que dans son projet de loi sur les symboles religieux dans la fonction publique et la laïcité, on va insérer la clause nonobstant, the notwithstanding clause, ce qui détonne, selon moi, de façon assez nette avec la façon de fonctionner du gouvernement d'alternance, le PLQ, qui est fédéraliste. Donc, tout ça combiné au fait, tout ça à Québec, combiné au fait qu'à Ottawa, on a Justin Trudeau et les libéraux qui peuvent être vus, si on veut, comme les gardiens de la charte. Hein. Trudeau, évidemment, pour des raisons symboliques, mais également pour des raisons idéologiques en termes de libéralisme fédéral. Bref, c'est possible que cette troisième voie-là, de plusieurs façons, puisse raviver des tensions entre Québec et Ottawa, contrairement à ce qu'on pouvait observer lorsqu'on avait un gouvernement à Québec qui était clairement fédéraliste et qui pouvait être plus réticent, par exemple, en fait, pas mal plus réticent à, par exemple, insérer une clause nonobstant. Donc, il n'est pas impossible de voir raviver des tensions, notamment de nature constitutionnelle. Pour l'instant, ce n'est pas de cette nature-là. Donc, voilà pour Québec. Je suis content parce que j'ai suivi le plan que Graham a énoncé, c'est-à-dire parler de Québec et ensuite la dynamique avec Ottawa. Donc maintenant, est-ce que cette dynamique à Québec peut avoir des répercussions sur l'élection fédérale qui s'en vient? C'est pas impossible, mais je pense pas évidemment que la CAQ va s'ingérer de façon directe dans la campagne. Ça m'étonnerait beaucoup, quoi qu'il va certainement avoir une sorte de liste d'épicerie ou d'attente, si on veut, qui va être énoncée. Mais il peut y avoir un effet important qui soit indirect si les enjeux qui sont omniprésents dans les relations Québec-Ottawa permettent aux conservateurs et au Bloc d'en profiter. Et vous allez voir pourquoi je parle de ces deux parties-là en particulier. Les trois enjeux qui pourraient être omniprésents dans les relations entre les deux gouvernements et qui pourraient bénéficier au Bloc et où les conservateurs sont les suivants. La laïcité, on peut penser à l'effet niqab lors de l'élection fédérale de 2015. En tout cas, certains candidats du NPD s'en souviennent, et des autres partis d'ailleurs. Deuxièmement, l'immigration, pour des raisons évoquées. Et troisièmement, je parlais de la déclaration d'impôt unique. C'est un sujet qui peut paraître précis, niché, mais c'est simple, c'est concret. Tout le monde comprend ce que ça implique et ça faciliterait la vie des citoyens. Sur ces trois enjeux-là, il y a deux camps, les conservateurs et le Bloc, qui se distinguent entre eux de façon très claire, le Bloc étant souverainiste, et d'un autre camp, il y a les libéraux et le NPD. Ça va être intéressant de voir en quoi le NPD comment le NPD va faire pour se distinguer du Parti libéral sur ces enjeux, pour ne pas apparaître comme étant une simple pâle copie du Parti libéral. Bon, bien sûr, il pourra adopter différentes stratégies, par l'attaquer un certain bilan qui est moins progressiste que les libéraux le laissaient entendre sur certains aspects. Mais bref, ça va être intéressant de voir ces deux blocs-là, Bloc conservateur et libéraux NPD, sur ces trois enjeux-là, laïcité, immigration, déclaration d'impôt unique. qui pourrait avoir un effet assez important sur la campagne électorale fédérale de 2015. Et je vais m'arrêter ici. On pourra parler d'enjeux plus précis ou autres thèmes lors de la discussion.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-François. Peter, à vous la parole.
Well, I'm here from the boring province of Ontario.
I'm not sure it's boring anymore.
So I had to add a little wax to my mustache to just increase the sort of flavor. So this past fall, General Motors announced that they were closing their plant in Oshawa. And the Premier of Ontario, who had run on an open for business platform and had big signs placed up, the next day said, well, that ship has sailed. And so I think it's worth thinking about whether there have been other ships that have sailed in terms of the Ontario we've known, in terms of particularly its participation within the Canadian Federation. And to think more specifically in the context of the next at least 3.5 years, where Ontario might be in the Federation. And the gist of my presentation is that probably not very present and perhaps not very productive. But perhaps explosive at moments. I mean, certainly in the context of the election, I mean, it's a significant change in that it was an election of a Conservative party that had been trying to win power since it lost it in 2003. Had tried to make a move to the middle in advance of that election, but then changed their leader at the last minute, who was much more comfortable with a more bombastic style of conservatism, if you like. It's left us with a premier who probably has the least preparation of any premier in Ontario's history in terms of understanding, for instance, a parliamentary system and how it works, or even having a sense of the province beyond the city. I mean, some have suggested that Doug Ford ran to be Premier of Ontario largely so he could be Mayor of Toronto. And in his early actions in terms of changing the number of councillors and intervening in the election, there seemed at least to be some truth to that. Although presumably he will grow into his role. I mean, a premier who hasn't necessarily got a sense of the taboos and practices and culture of the Canadian political class. And again, the invocation of the notwithstanding clause in the context of that law on the municipal election in a way broke with kind of an emerging constitutional convention that if this clause was to be used, it would be used carefully with a careful weighing of rights, and certainly that was not the experience of it. And so there was an important breaking of a taboo, which probably does open the way for François Legault to begin to use it in a fairly, or at least to muse about using it in a way that he's no longer afraid of potential response. Certainly Ontario will probably not be very present in intergovernmental relations because the Premier and his government have a very strong internal focus. They've shown themselves to have a very ambitious agenda. I mean, what do provinces do? Healthcare and education. And in both healthcare and education, there seems to be a desire to bring forward, you might almost say, a kind of 1990s managerial agenda. Ontario has among the lowest spending per capita across most areas of the provincial state. So I don't think there's easy or low-hanging fruit. And so if there's a desire to reduce spending, it is going to come through these forms of change, also at the level of municipal government. I think at the level of the Premier, this is driven by a fairly simplistic view of these questions. Speaking to someone who was doing research for the Municipal Government Review, seemed to be saying that the view from on top was really there just needed to be fewer politicians at the end of the process. Now, obviously, the provincial state has some capacity to think about other goals that might be achieved through a reorganization of municipal government and regional municipalities. But obviously, the strategy of the government is to move quickly. But these are very large reforms. They're very bureaucratically heavy. And we might ask if it will collapse under its own weight, but certainly a government that's doing these things is probably not one that has a lot of time and energy for intergovernmental relations. So it's a very internal focused agenda. We might compare this with that of McGuinty and Wynne, who in many ways were much more involved in an intergovernmental space, in part because they wished to do things by passing some of the costs onto the federal government. They wanted to renew a certain number of policies but saw an advantage to doing them in a pan-Canadian fashion rather than in Ontario. And so we saw, whether it was improvement in the Canada pension plans, child care, a push for an enhanced national child benefit, the move to pharmacare, those are all cases where we had an Ontario government that wanted to play in an intergovernmental realm, I think in part because they didn't want to shoulder the entire cost of planning and delivering those programs. It's a government that, in addition to its internal focus, has shown no real intergovernmental vision. It was absent from the platform, any kind of language of province, Council of the Federation, federal partners, which is maybe not that surprising given what we know about Ontarians and not necessarily thinking of their provincial government in that sense, but there was certainly no mention of that in the platform or the throne speech. We'll have to see in the budget. There's usually a few axes to grind with the federal government around transfers and Ontario's fair share. We'll see if that language comes back. The only real intergovernmental issues engaged in the platform as intergovernmental issues were around, on the one hand, mental health. So there was a desire to see some pan-Canadian action on mental health and a role there. And secondly, no carbon tax was really the main one that came to the fore and has come to the fore. Also in the throne speech, there will be no carbon tax. They will protect Ontarians from a carbon tax or work with premiers who are opposed to the taxing of carbon. And in a way, this is maybe not that surprising, but it is surprising when we say compare with the Mike Harris government, which also had a very strong internal focus, but nevertheless appointed a separate intergovernmental relations minister, as opposed to Ford, who's kept that on himself. Was involved in the ministerial councils of the time, commissioned the Access report from Tom Courchain. So honestly, in the end, what we might see with Ontario is what we might call a non-honest broker. We saw in December 2018, for instance, a very public threat to walk out of the First Minister's meeting around questions of setting the agenda, which struck me as a very kind of non-Ontario way to engage in this kind of situation. We may in fact see in Ontario that when it does intervene is moved by very short-term reading of Ontario interests. To me, it's not impossible that something like Premier Moe's 50-50 equalization program might appeal to Doug Ford. This idea that Ontario is getting hosed by equalization, and so there needs to be a response. Similarly, the looming conflict around the Canada Health Act with Quebec might be a situation where Ford would see a reason to engage with François Legault on this idea of, why is the federal government imposing conditions when the money's not there? But ultimately, to close on this question of looking forward to the election, and I won't say much on that, I think the intergovernmental affairs issue is number 100 on the list of 100 priorities for Ontarians. But for the election, I think what will play much more is Ontarians' understanding of Ford, because in some ways their decision in the last provincial election they get to redo in the federal election. Do they want to go with a fairly populist form of conservatism, or are they willing to stick with a kind of form of liberalism? And particularly in the suburbs of Toronto, which I get to see when I take the bus to the airport and all the park and ride lots, that sort of, it's there that a significant piece of this next federal election will play. And so whether Ford has delivered or whether the problems around healthcare and education come to the fore and people think twice, I think will be significant in determining the vote in an important tranche of the electorate.
Thank you very much. Richard.
I'd rather not stand up. Is this the... Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. You may regret that. So it is a pleasure for me to report on the only province of the country which actually seems to be sane, and in which politics has a degree of predictability about it. The government, in some sense, hangs by a thread. It is a minority government with the Greens holding the balance of power and the governing party having fewer seats than the opposition. But the situation, I think, is largely self-replicating. The Liberals don't want an election because they would probably lose ground. The Greens don't want an election because they would probably lose ground. The NDP might be happy to have an election, but they have plenty of other things to do. So I think that in some sense the provincial politics, even though it's a minority government situation, is a kind of business as usual situation, except that the left is in power rather than the right, and that's relatively rare. And I think that it is the objective of the government to stay in power. The government is actually remarkably aligned with the federal Liberal government. The big tension, obviously, is the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the coastal protection stuff. And the government of BC has genuine disagreements with Ottawa on this. On the other hand, it concedes that mostly the jurisdictional responsibility is federal, and that the NDP's own internal coalition has a strong kind of resource-producing union-based component. And so, in some ways, it would rather do the kind of symbolic minimum and let the Trudeau government worry with the more difficult coalition-building parts. And meanwhile, Vancouver hopes to be a major beneficiary of infrastructure money, and the government of British Columbia is not particularly interested in making trouble for the Trudeau government in that respect. Most of the debate inside the province, which goes on, the one thing that is striking about provincial politics in the last 10 or 15 years is that the voice of social conservatives has been silenced, right? There are plenty of social conservatives in the province. It is the most secular jurisdiction in North America. Let's be clear about this. Even more, actually, than Quebec has been for decades. So there isn't a lot of organized religion really effective in BC politics, but especially given that the opposition, the kind of the capitalist side of a left versus right thing, is a version of the Liberal Party. It is the most conservative Liberal Party in Canada, but it is, the fact that it carries the name Liberal is not irrelevant. Yes, it's not. It's relevant. It is explicitly a coalition. Its members understand this. They speak publicly about it. It is a coalition whose central organizing thread is keeping the socialists out of power. But the high ground of the party is occupied by emancipated, socially liberal people, many of whom are happy to move into federal politics as capital L liberals. And this has had the effect of making the debates in BC on a lot of these questions debates within a relatively narrow socially liberal bound. And that means that we are not in provincial politics at least, we're not a voice for social conservatism, not provincially, that is. Implications for federal elections? Well, I think that John Horgan has a bit of a problem in the sense that he is a New Democrat and he can't betray his own party. But I think, like a lot of people, he worries that a rejuvenated NDP might just hand seats over to the Conservatives. And this sort of brings me to sort of British Columbia as a battleground. The seats south of the Fraser River in particular, but also sort of the eastern suburbs of BC, are like the Ontario 905. These are immigrant-rich, quite diverse places where seats are won and lost by relatively narrow margins. The additional complication in the BC case is that many of these places are chronically three-way races. And so quite modest perturbations in any of the Conservative, Liberal, or NDP shares could produce potentially quite sweeping changes. Again, the total number of seats in play isn't like that in the 905. It's not as important as suburban Toronto, but it's pretty important. But it's also hard to read, and so it'll be interesting to see how much attention this part of the country gets as the next campaign unfolds. People might actually just give up on trying to figure out what the strategic outcomes are. And the truth of the matter is that although in 2015 the lower mainland of British Columbia delivered a big whack of seats to the Liberals, and did so by margins that were quite shocking. I mean, it was actually kind of amusing to watch Lead Now pretend that the NDP were actually competitive in some of these ridings, including they made a call in Vancouver-Granville that clearly it was too close to call and that Lead Now people should vote NDP. And of course, Jody Wilson-Raybould won an outright majority of the votes in that seat. So that brings me to Jody Wilson-Raybould. How am I doing on time here, Graham? I mean, I think that one of the oddities of the situation is that, you could construct the current SNC-Lavalin issue as a betrayal of the kind of new politics, including feminist and reconciliation-driven, the kind of new politics that Justin Trudeau promised, with Ms. Wilson-Raybould in some ways kind of embodying the betrayal, but it appears she's going to run as a Liberal. And so, at the end of the day, the city of Vancouver is unlikely to change at all. My expectation would be that the Liberals will lose some seats in the suburbs, but how many is not clear. And in federal politics, as in BC politics, it is the south of the Fraser where the most volatility could occur. I guess the question that I worry about and wonder about, and then I'll conclude on this, is the place of asylum seekers versus white nationalism. Okay, I read Andrew Scheer as, to the extent that he emphasizes asylum seekers as indicative of loss of control of our borders, is trying to play a card that he believes, with some justice, will divide the immigrant community against itself. New Canadians who have come through by the conventional routes are not really much less likely than persons of Canadian birth or European ancestry to worry at the asylum seekers as queue jumpers and all of that. And so this is that card could be politically useful. By the same token, however, it could blow up in his face because if it becomes simply a synecdoche for a larger attack on diversity and immigration, well, then that would be a seriously dangerous thing for him to do from the perspective of his own interests. So I'm going to be watching that with some care. And then I guess the final thing, the entrails of the Burnaby South by-election, which actually mostly reproduced the recent past, nonetheless saw a sort of, I think it was an 11% share for the People's Party. And in a riding which is very, very diverse. I mean, by quite a margin, the plurality, ethnicity in Burnaby South is Chinese, varying forms of diaspora Chinese as well as PRC. And so a 10% vote in Burnaby South would think that has the Conservative strategists worrying about footsteps. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. I want to note for the record, it took us 37 minutes into the conference before we raised SNC-Lavalin for the first time. So 37 minutes. Melanie, over to you.
Okay, so I want to locate myself first so that I can hopefully make Alberta less confusing for people who are observing it from the outside. I'm a second-generation Canadian who was born and raised in rural Alberta, to the point where I've renewed my driver's license several times, giving a very precise land location with reference to the 4th meridian. I now have lived, since I've come back to, after a wonderful stint here at McGill, have lived on the east end of downtown Calgary since 2012. This is the picture, I think the rural picture is what people have of Alberta outside of the province. And there's a couple of things I want to highlight just about background so that we can make sense of the dog and pony show that is Alberta politics. Alberta is now one of the most urbanized, if not the most urbanized province in the Federation. It both is and is not a conservative place. You have to be very clear about what you mean by conservatism in order to be able to define it that way. If you mean it in terms of partisanship, like Michigan-style party identification, where people say, oh, I identify with this party, then yeah, like it's unequivocally that. Just by way of reference, I would imagine in the next federal election, the Liberal seats, the federal seats in Edmonton will probably hold. All of the ones in Calgary will go. And the only reason why I think they got them in the first place was because the Calgary Liberal candidates federally were former Liberal MLAs with large personal votes, and that's pretty much it. They were close seats. They're gone. Calgary will go completely Conservative. In the next federal election, the provincial election is a little bit more thorny. If you want to look at Albertans and define I think one of the errors that gets made consistently, though, in looking at Alberta, especially from the outside, is that people will look at those voting results and make assumptions about public opinion that are patently false. So there's any number of academic research pieces that have been published about public opinion in Canada, about how the main regional divide is between Quebec and everyone else, about what ought to be done about Quebec. There aren't main divides coming out of Western Canada. We have good research even from the spring of 2018 that shows that most Albertans on average are left of center. They self-identify as like a 4 in the 4 range on a 0 to 10 ideology question. So they actually identify as on the political left. If you listen to how people talk about provincial politics, even on the flight yesterday, somebody who's very clearly partisanly conservative said, oh, well, Rachel Notley, like, she didn't make any mistakes. Like, the context that she's dealing with is not her fault, but we really do need to get them out of there. So you can see that this is like a partisan push that's going there. It's not necessarily, it's not issues-based. It absolutely isn't issue-based. So the first thing I would do is resist the tension to say that all of the frightening things that have to do with some parts of Canadian public opinion are coming from Alberta, because I actually think that they're ubiquitous, and I think we've got evidence to show that. Same thing holds with populism. Prairie populism is a thing that is a long-standing 20th century kind of thing, and it is very different from European populism. So the thing I would look for coming up is when people start to use populism, what flavor does it look like? If it's prairie populism, it's going to be defining the corrupt elites and saying we need to protect regular good people from corrupt elites. And you can see there's a good, solid left-right split, even not only in Alberta, but Saskatchewan as well, about whether or not this is a like bankers, the social credit would fight against bankers versus unions, things like this. You can see that there's a strong ideological divide on that. What they don't do is define who the people are. They just say regular folks. The European version of this is much more focused on defining who pure people are. And so for me, the shift that I would worry about when I look at populism is if we start to talk about what does it mean to be a real Canadian, say, as opposed to talking about the elite side of things. In Alberta, there really isn't any conversation about what it means to be a real Albertan. Like, this just is not on the political agenda. So Alberta populism is always there. People who win elections need to be populist, but it has to be about focusing on how you're going to protect regular folks from corrupt elites. So Jim Prentice erred fatally on this in 2015. When the price of oil starts to fall in 2014, we get the budget that pleases no one in anticipation of the spring 2015 election. And part of that really turned people on populism was, well, oil and gas has made a lot of money, but now that the price of oil is tanking, they need protection, so we're not going to do anything to their taxes. And everyone across the ideological spectrum said, yeah, but if we're going to hurt, I mean, they made mad money, like they should help us out with this stuff as well. So Alberta is a conservative populist place, defined as conservative partisanship and prairie populism in terms of public opinion, and like European style populism, we don't have that. And I mean, when I see people starting to trade their politics on this, I think this concerns me, but I think it concerns me because I think it has traction in Alberta in the same way that it does elsewhere. For the Federation, the current, I mean, and so I say this on the caveat that if somebody had told me that I would look at the 2019 provincial election starting with a debate about a white nationalist or a candidate with white nationalist views being dumped by the party, and then the main narrative at the end of the day was it really is just about the economy and pointing out the white nationalism is mudslinging, I have to admit I find this deeply distressing, and I'm also not surprised that this is the way that the narrative is being played out. I want to talk a little bit about the Alberta 2019 election and what that's going to mean for the federal 2019 election. This will be the third election in a row where the outcome is probably going to be surprising. 2012, we were supposed to get a Wild Rose majority government. Undecideds stayed and swung on the last 3 days of the campaign. 2015, at this point, if you had asked me to make a prediction, I would not have said NDP. And the best estimates I've seen of undecided voters this week have them about 30%. So I'm going to suggest that maybe the campaign will matter, and I am not, despite the evidence that I'm seeing at this point, going to hang my hat on making a prediction at this stage, because the past 2 times, had we done that, we would have been spectacularly wrong. So I just say political science can't predict very well, and I will be content with that. Things that I think are interesting that are going to come out, the pipeline debate gets framed interestingly in Alberta, where the pipelines and equalization, I think, are linked. And the thing that concerns me about how this relates to the Federation is that there's a large constituency in Alberta that feels like the rest of the country has abandoned them and just does not care. And I think they do that with cause. I've gone outside of Alberta and heard people, when the price of oil was crashing, saying, well, it really can't be that bad in Alberta, which is true if you look at Statistics Canada returns. We still have the highest median and mean income in the country. We still have some of the best economic growth. This is not the perception in Calgary, where wages and ability to basically pull down a very large salary have gone from being very easy to do to being much more difficult. So now we're just kind of coming back into national norms, and it hurts. I get this. If somebody cut my salary by $50,000, I would be rageful. So I can understand kind of where that's coming from on some level, and on another level, part of it's just we know what booms look like, and why are we surprised? But what this means is that there's deep frustration in some constituencies about this gross misunderstanding of equalization, that money comes from Alberta to pay for other people's bills. When I teach this to undergrads, I teach it in the context of federal taxation and spending power, and it's my favorite moment because I have all of these Alberta-based undergrads. When I say, so what does this mean for equalization? They say it's federal money, and the federal government would take it anyway, and I just hate that you've burst my Alberta bubble about this. And it's it's beautiful for me as a teaching moment, but they're not convincing their parents that this is how this works when they go home and chat about this at dinner. So Jason Kenney has promised to hold a referendum on equalization. Foolishly, I think this is a gross lack of leadership for somebody who ought to know better. But he has promised this, if he wins the 2019 election, that there will be a referendum on equalization. He can't do this. I will stop going into rant at this moment, but there is that. The issue of the pipeline is also very much, Justin Trudeau gets no credit for actually having purchased it. It's more the idea, and this is what the provincial election is trading on. Rachel Notley is being tied to Justin Trudeau, and they are using the antipathy towards Justin Trudeau. And I think a lot of this is actually Kenny's own personal antipathy towards Justin Trudeau to campaign, linking those two together. I mean, it really is a question of, if the 2019 election in Alberta is fought on the economy, it will go to the United Conservatives. If it's fought on other sorts of things, integrity, leadership, more social issues, it's much more of a toss-up. But if it looks like it could herald a certain kind of antagonism into the Federation that is maybe reminiscent of the Harper days, but if you actually have a federal government that wants to do more, govern like how Trudeau has by bringing in provinces, then this presents a shift, pretty profound one.
Merci beaucoup. So as I mentioned earlier, we have about 50 minutes for conversation on themes that I think were particularly well laid out by our panelists. There is a microphone, and I can see someone is already at the microphone, which is excellent. But perhaps just so that we can get the conversation going. Oh no, there we are. Our first question to the panelists. Please introduce yourself.
Oh, no, sorry, if anyone else.
Oh, a programming note, the microphone will now be a roving microphone around the room. So please just raise your hand if you have a question to put to the panel. And to get us started, maybe I'll riff on one of the final comments you made, Melanie, about the presence of Ottawa in the provincial dynamic, and I'd be interested to hear from our other panels. From the perspective of your province or your region, how would you characterize the sense of belonging to the broader Canadian community, and how present is Ottawa in the provincial dynamic?
Very. I think part of the silencing of the socially conservative voices in BC politics is sort of the silencing of the interior of the province. The noise in BC politics is mostly about the southwestern part of the province. And if you just think about issues on the national stage or issues on the local stage in Vancouver, they're the same issues. The drivers of medical assistance in dying, for example, court cases in Vancouver. Legalization of cannabis, of course, it was never required in Vancouver in some sense, but still. that under both NDP and Liberal governments, and under both Liberal and Conservative governments federally, the National Criminal Code has been a major element in a wide range of discussions on drug abuse, drug control, health policy more generally, and all of that. So there's that, for example. The most wrenching issues in a kind of acute sense, at least, are about building transportation links and housing policy, the price of housing, control of offshore money, a whole range of questions in which everybody agrees Ottawa is inevitably involved, often in ways that require federal-provincial cooperation. And so, really, since the election of Gordon Campbell in 2001, BC has not been at odds with Ottawa on much that is fundamental. And even the carbon tax, for God's sakes. I mean, the price of oil can go up and down all at once. It still is going to cost an arm and a length to drive a car in Vancouver, as it should. And the creation of a carbon tax will have zero impact on BC politics because we're there already. The failure of the carbon tax may make it more difficult for governments of BC to stay with the plan of increasing the carbon tax. But in general, BC politics and federal politics are remarkably aligned.
Peter Jean-François?
Well, I mean, I think the rather significant change in the deputation of the Conservative Party in this last election does change the dynamic a bit, where we had about a 20-year period of movement between the provincial Conservatives under Harris became federal Conservatives under Harper. We had movements of people like Jerry Butts into Ottawa with the Trudeau win in 2015, and so that there was a really strong importation of Ontario beefs into the, and that played out in an inter-provincial dynamic. So I think that will probably be reduced. I mean, for Ontarians, I don't think they pay that much attention to their politics and much more federally focused. But nevertheless, at the level of the parties themselves, both the Ontario election, but increasingly federal elections with the change of the demographic weight are played in the suburbs of Toronto. And so the partisan organization by the two parties and figuring out what works in one election, I think, will be played out. And so in a way, we'll have a bit of a Groundhog Day election, I think, in the 905. I mean, the parties have different strengths than they were. The NDP maybe has a different role federally than provincially in terms of how it can play in that area, but I think it will spin around very similar kind of populist appeals from the part of the Conservative Party, some that Richard Johnson pointed out about sort of this playing to this question of asylum seekers, but probably also about trying to keep everyday costs low. And so we'll see whether the Liberals have learned something from last time about how they might counter that in a campaign.
Buck a beer for the country?
if they could promise it, they would.
Jean-François or Melanie?
As we have a question, I would be tempted to be very short and just say le confort et l'indifférence, which I think really represents the sense of public opinion toward the Canadian Federation right now. And just to link to what I said before, the fact that the provincial government is willing to use the notwithstanding clause might ease things in a sense. It might ease things in the sense that people would not fight in front in front of the Supreme Court, and it would prevent judicial saga. So, yeah, that would be it.
Melanie?
The only comment I'd add is that I wouldn't underestimate the power of Western alienation. So this gets Alberta, Saskatchewan, probably the BC interior, closer to the Alberta side than not, where this is where you get the disconnect between what people would actually support in terms of public opinion and the political framing. So people can be totally in agreement with the actual substance of a policy, but if it's framed as the federal government doing something to us, you'll get lightning opposition on those grounds alone. So I'd like it to be indifference. It would be, that would be a nice break, but I have to admit, it's amazing even in my own mind where like things framed that way, I still have knee-jerk reactions myself, despite the fact that I really do know better and have been trained better, but I would not underestimate that as the force behind how some people will react to a policy that they actually agree with.
Thank you. We have our first question.
Can you hear me? Okay, my name is Jeanette Lamontagne. I'm with the McGill University Retiree Association, and I thank you all for your presentations. They were all excellent. I have a comment, and it's more of a lament, and it's directed towards our Western friends. When the whole Trans Mountain saga occurred and BC decided to oppose it, I just felt, from a point of view of a citizen of Quebec, thank goodness, you know, an interprovincial fight that doesn't include Quebec. And I felt so good, but it was so short-lived because it turned so quickly against us. It came back to the Energy East that had been dead for at least a couple of years. And so how do we mend this over again? I'm baffled. So I wondered if from the BC perspective and the Alberta perspective, if there's a way to fix things.
Who'd like to take that on first?
I have to say it's perceived differently in Alberta. I don't think that there's large antipathy towards Quebec because Energy East. It pops back up again every now and then because New Brunswick will say, oh, but we want this for our refineries. But I think anybody who has been paying attention to anything that a mayor of Montreal has said for quite some time has gotten the memo that this is kind of not going anywhere. So I wouldn't I can understand how it reads very differently here, but in Alberta, even in Calgary, I don't feel like the antipathy that's directed towards Quebec, because I don't want to deny that that exists, is not because of Energy East, it's because of perceptions that are wrong about equalization. It almost is always exclusively equalization, and this perception that Alberta pays for childcare in Quebec, which it doesn't. But like literally, this is like if I have to say that there's a repeated conversation I have with like regular folks about like the Federation in Alberta, it's that one. It's amazing. Like the lack of, you can tell the other people who've spent time in Western Canada are just kind of like, oh yeah, no, totally. This is the only debate that we have. The thing about Trans Mountain is that, like, to me, it looks like how it's an interesting tension between what's a short-term, is one of many things that looks like it's a tension between what's a short-term victory or a short-term thing that you can say that will have like short-term electoral payoff versus the longer-term issue. And the longer-term issue I just highlight is that there is a pipeline that's in the ground, it leaks in places, and we have to do something about that. And that means that you have to talk to the people whose land it's on where it's leaking and actually come to a solution. That this has kind of been absent from the narrative, to me, strikes me as strategically short-sighted, but that's just where I'm sitting, not working in oil and gas on the east end of the downtown of Calgary.
In terms of the kind of active parts of agenda setting in BC, there is, BC and Quebec are allies, right? The Energy East issue is not an issue for British Columbians. And indeed, and of course, carbon tax or carbon pricing, the provinces are not at odds with each other. I mean, that is what's striking to me, is that there is, that there's plenty of disagreement and debate. And to be sure, there is an old subtext in the SNC Lavalin story. Oh, here we go again, corruption, blah 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 blah, and the the peculiar focus on Quebec for Liberal governments. But it's subtext, and it's not clear whether it has staying power. For the most part, the province rolls along, engaging with the federal government on matters of substance, and under this government, it largely agrees with them. And meanwhile, French immersion enrollments continue to balloon in BC. We have a teacher crisis in that respect. And whenever you have sort of public events on these matters, Vancouver sort of comes across as a beacon of continental understanding.
Jean-François.
Yes, I can totally understand your reaction that when you see an intergovernment crisis or fight without Quebec, this is quite surprising. But in fact, I wouldn't say that it does not include Quebec, because our politicians did react to this. We remember François Legault talking about the pétrole sale of the West, And on the other hand, this is funny because when Melanie says that in Alberta, you can hear that, oh, you know, Alberta pays for Quebec childcare. Well, some nationalists in Quebec are arguing that when the federal use its budget to finance or to subsidize the oil industry or to buy a pipeline, well, in fact, Quebecers pay 20 or 25% of that money. So some nationalists can use that argument that, well, our taxes are used to that pétrole sale, as our premier might say. So it does include Quebec indirectly, but it does at some point.
Thank you. I think we do have another question, so I'm going to roll right along. Brother Seidel.
Hello, Leslie Seidel from IRPP. This is for Jean-Francois. It's too early to say that we have achieved or are going through a realignment, a partisan realignment in Quebec, but obviously the last election was an important development, and so we now have a CAQ majority government. And I want to ask you about their approach to governing. It seems to me that this is a government, obviously, that was elected on some populist, for lack of a better term, positions. The amount of detail, there wasn't actually a full-fledged CAQ election program or manifesto, as the British would call it, but you can go on your website and piece together the commitments. One of them was reducing immigration by 10,000. Yet, on that particular one, there's no real constituency in Quebec for that. In fact, there are a number of business organizations that have over time, they weren't present in the election because there are restrictions on that sort of thing, but there are a number of business organizations that point out there's a huge labor shortage in this province, as there is in many parts of the country, particularly in smaller towns and rural areas and so on. And here we have a government that is actually going to reduce. Now, it doesn't have all the tools in its hands. Asylum seekers are federal. Family reunification is federal. Moreover, and this is a really important point that nobody seems to have picked up in the media, the agreement with the federal government in 1991 provides that the payment to Quebec from the federal government, supposedly for settlement and integration, cannot be lower in a future year from what it was in the previous year. Why would a CAQ government actually want to open that agreement and risk receiving less money? It's somewhat dishonest that they should be receiving the same amount of money and receiving fewer immigrants, but put that aside. So, you know, what is the interest in actually sitting down on that from the CAQ side? From the federal side, it's easy enough to explain why they wouldn't want to sit down. Secondly, on the secularism, very little detail in their program, but they are going to be tabling legislation that supposedly will go beyond Bouchard-Taylor and include teachers. They were not in the list of people in authority positions in the Bouchard-Taylor report. And today in Le Devoir, we have the immigration minister, who at one point wasn't going to be responsible for this file, but seems to be, at least in his own mind, saying that the government, and I'm quoting from Le Devoir this morning, has a moral contract with Quebecers on that allows it to use the notwithstanding clause to protect this particular legislation. So I'm just sort of interested in your reaction. You've got a minor party that comes to government. Often when they do, they begin to fudge. It doesn't look as though this particular party in government is going to fudge. Maybe I'm wrong, but I welcome your reaction.
Thank you. Jean-Francois.
I will start by your second point on secularism. Yes, clearly the government will go beyond Bouchard-Taylor, which we often call the consensus, Bouchard-Taylor, which seems not to be a consensus in 2019. Well, it's not even a consensus among Bouchard-Taylor nowadays. So, anyway, Yeah, we're at McGill, I think. Anyway, we might be heard by. Yeah, the moral contract with using the notwithstanding clause. Clearly, the CAQ wants to do it fast. They want to do it in their first year, and it seems to me to be a good strategy, because this might be there might create some waves, some reaction, some negative reaction. But even if they go beyond Bouchard-Taylor, they integrated. Well, it seemed that they integrated la clause grand-père. I don't know how to translate that. Grandfather clause. Oh, that easy. The grandfather clause, which will prevent the media to jump on a current teacher that would be loved by students and everyone, but would lose his or her job just because she or he is wearing a religious symbol. So yeah, it is supposed to touch teachers. Teachers are supposed to be touched by this measure. Now, another question will be, should it touch kindergarten teachers for kids? This will probably be an issue at the National Assembly. Yeah, so they go beyond Bouchard-Taylor, but they introduce this grandfather clause. But it seems quite clear to me that they want to do this fast, and they want to move on as soon as they can from that. And I think I will talk about populism when we will probably have a chance to talk about populism in a broader discussion.
And our crowd is warming up. I have Graham Fraser and then Alain Naël.
Graham Fraser, visiting professor at MISC. One of the issues that interests me as a dynamic in elections is anger. And Professor Thomas and Professor Johnson both referred to the risk of populism transforming itself into either a debate as to who's a real Albertan or a real Canadian, or attacking asylum seekers and playing off asylum seekers. And it seems to me that the leader of the United Conservative Party, who was all about diversity when he was a federal minister, is now all about anger. And there's no doubt that the Premier of Ontario is all about anger. And I'm wondering the degree to which you all see the risk of anger becoming a major anger and controlling anger versus sunny ways, if you like, becoming a dynamic in the Alberta provincial election and in the federal election in the fall.
Who'd like to go first? Melanie?
So the other connection I can't help but draw on this one is related to gender, because I'm a gender and politics person, and there's a number of things I see where I see the way that they're framing populism, I see the way that anger is being mobilized, and I see it linking to a very particular way of performing masculinity. So this is Jason Kenney and his pickup truck. As somebody who is rural, I know exactly what pickup trucks ought to be used for, and like this is like as a joking aside, when I'm in Calgary, I'm just like, you don't need that in the city, God, stop it. You don't see it in Vancouver, thankfully for that. But I mean, the Derek Fildebrandt also, I think probably the greatest gift to Jason Kenney was that Derek Fildebrandt was entitled to his entitlements and got kicked out of caucus, because he would have been very difficult to manage. But he is also very much, I have other people who know him, who I've spoken to who know him better, who just say that he is a very deeply angry individual, and that this kind of comes through people who work through the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and stuff like this. So there's an undercurrent of anger, and then it gets performed in a certain kind of way. So it gets activated in Alberta politics for the particular kind of unemployment that's in the oil patch now, where it's either an expectation of wages that will never come back, or an expectation of earning a certain kind of way with little to no credentials, not even a high school kind of credential that way. I see it linked with Scheer with the display around the budget. Like that to me just looked like a bunch of schoolboys who had lost their temper. And it seems like it's toxic masculinity politics. And the difficulty is that I'm not sure how well that works. I think it works with a particular constituency that might donate a lot, but I'm not sure how well this resonates with voters in general. But I also don't know how much it turns off voters in general. So I know what my reaction is to that. But they wouldn't, I'm not sure that it is as damaging as what I think it might be, depending on who's looking at it. Like, it's clearly damaging for people who won't be prepared to be mobilized by that. The other part that I think this ties into with other sorts of things that we're seeing with the discussion in Quebec is what it means when this gets activated into yellow vest protests or certain kind of anti-immigration sorts of things. I know in Alberta, when we see these things, they're very rare, they're very loud, but it is very much white, nationalist, explicitly racist kind of thing that gets done. And that you have somebody like Andrew Scheer who's prepared to speak to that constituency and not say, but I'm going to reject that part of your politics, and then proceed to do the display that we just saw in the House of Commons and that we're continuing to see. This looks to me like toxic masculinity done with impunity. And like I say, I don't know how much, like I would have thought that there would have been a line over that where people would just kind of have not stepped over it. That was probably foolish on my part. Well, it'll be interesting to see how well that actually gets activated and what, like, say, the average voter decides to do with it.
Thank you. Richard or Peter?
First of all, if I were Justin Trudeau, I would worry as much about sorrow as anger. That there may be a decline in turnout, and that turnout will be differentially from people who voted for the first time and voted Liberal in 2015. And so part of the theatre of SNC-Lavalin is the disappointment of expectations over doing a new kind of politics, being publicly feminist, and pursuing a reconciliation agenda. And the ability of Justin Trudeau to claim to be some kind of avatar on those things is gone. So that's changing your agenda a bit, Graham, but that's the point. But the anger business, I think that there has all along been an explosive potential underneath the surface of the Canadian party system. If, for example, you do a straight no chaser Canada-US comparison or ROC-US comparison on exactly the same questions in the general agenda of immigration, diversity, and multiculturalism, you cannot see the 49th parallel. You just can't. What is more, people who identify with the Conservative Party of Canada or who vote for the Conservative Party of Canada are indistinguishable from Republicans. And I would venture to say if I had the money to take this to Australia, they would be indistinguishable from the coalition components of the Australian government as well. And that the partisans are divided along these lines, that is divided between Conservatives and others, rather is the case in actually most of the rest of the world, as a matter of fact. The difference is that the strategic logic of Canadian elections has in some sense kept the Conservative Party of Canada inside the diversity multicultural camp, except when things get in extremis, as they were doing toward the end of the 2015 campaign. And I think, you know, the difference between federal and provincial, Kenny, may explain partly the geographic logic of the electoral system. So, so, you know, that's why it seems to me Scheer's strategy has this kind of subtlety to it. But if that anger spills into the election, it's a problem for the Conservative Party, primarily. And I would say, and I think that the Yellow Vest Canada-style thing illustrates that you have to have a geographically differentiated basis for anger to create the kind of coordination point for the expression of that. And so it may be white nationalists, it may be people with the wrong kind of tattoos, but it started in Alberta because of the oil business. And in 1993, it was a decade and a half of preoccupation with the constitutional agenda, which in the end of the day gave Jean Chrétien, with vote shares roughly like what Justin Trudeau has, some of the strongest majorities in Canadian political history.
The one thing I would just quickly add about this is, and it's an emerging observation, and I'm just making the observation, I don't think we've got enough information to analyze what's going on with this, but just to observe, I think nearly every single leak that's come forward through the UCP about things either related to the kamikaze campaign or candidates saying distasteful things have come from people of color. And when I don't want to read too much into comments or into Twitter or things like this, but there is a kind of brewing sort of thing where you can see that if Jason Kenney's going to hang his hat on a kind of degree of diversity, particularly related to communities of color, there seems to be a deep distrust, or at least an element that is very skeptical of this and is actively mobilizing against this in Alberta. But that's just because, I mean, I make that observation because we've just seen a pack of it come in the past couple of days, and I don't know how this is going to develop.
Thank you. We have Alain Noël and then Martin Papillon.
For all, it's actually a follow-up on the question on anger and populism. And one dimension of this populism in Canada and maybe this anger is attitudes toward bilingualism and by extension toward francophones. And we've seen in Ontario, in New Brunswick, and in Saskatchewan, in Alberta in a less direct way, a negative reaction to bilingualism, to francophone institutions, francophone laws or institutions that are important for the community. How important, is this important only because I'm a francophone in Quebec and I hear from francophones in Ontario, or is this significant in provincial politics? That's the first question. And the second question is more specifically to Richard Johnston. You wrote about the old formula of the Liberals of uniting francophiles and francophones against the Conservatives who desperately tried to ally francophones with francophobes. And is it, you wrote that this is over now, that's the old system, but are we turning back into this, or is this all peripheral?
So perhaps Richard first, and then we'll open it up.
It could be coming back. First of all, you know, the very first Conservative victory in 2006, almost all of the vote gains from 2004 to 2006 were in Quebec. They were in the parts of Quebec where Conservatives had traditional support, and half of the seat came in Quebec. The Harper government seemed to get off that agenda to try and rebuild some version of the old coalition for the Conservatives. And of course, the Bloc was standing in the way. If the Bloc is no longer standing in the way, then that does open up the possibility. And you know, one of the ironies of the Conservative leadership campaign is that it was Bernier who opposed the deal with the UPA and dairy farmers, who presented Scheer as having done a very old-fashioned deal. So there's that. The other thing is that if the Liberals survive, and I think that's been more in question for many more months than the public representation of polls has suggested. I've myself done some signal to noise stuff in polls that suggested it's been over for a year, at least a majority government for a year. But if the government survives, it may well survive because of a big block of Quebec seats, gains in Quebec indeed, that offset losses elsewhere. The difference is that it will be a block of seats that is predicated on fractionalization of the rest of the vote, in some sense, cornering the Federalist vote and a bit more, and then taking advantage of the fractionalization of the rest, which is different from the historic pattern of consolidation and consolidated mobility. Right? That's the old game in which Quebecers did not trifle with parties that were not governing parties. And that once in a generation or so, they would at least withdraw enough seats from the Liberals to deny them power, and then some of the time go all the way over to the other side. I don't think that world is gone. So if Quebec is the critical block to sustain the Liberals in power, then it will be a qualitatively different block from in the past. And meanwhile, you do see Andrew Scheer vacillating on this stuff, but I think he does have fantasies of putting together at least some part of the old system. He doesn't actually need that many seats in Quebec, provided he could profit from some
Peter, I won't put you on the spot, but I don't want to put you on the spot, but I will anyway. As a Franco-Ontarian, obviously followed the events of last fall very closely, and I couldn't help but tie Alain's question to your comment and your opening remarks about a government that seems much more turned inward. And I wondered if the two are linked in that a provincial government that would be more outward-looking to the Federation presumably might have taken a different approach to its treatment of its own francophone minority par souci des conséquences pour la Fédération. So I wondered if you might comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know if that's it, actually. I mean, there may be more broadly a passing of a 1960s to 1980s generation where we talked about Canada in almost kind of consociational terms, and we understood the importance of communities. And to me, a lot of what is at issue in Ontario is whether the Franco-Ontarian community is a constituent community or whether it's an interest group. And I think we have a set of provincial politicians who've really come, again, and it was debated within the Conservative Party with Patrick Brown making, was seen as really kind of historic opening to the community, and that obviously was swept away. But there may be a way in which our political parties and the leadership within them become much more tied to sort of very close electoral dynamics and aren't reproducing a language of what the community is. And leads to some of these questions about, you know, the notwithstanding clause, what's that? What are these communities, bilingualism, and it becomes much more sort of electorally organized in that manner. I would, and so, you know, the community has to organize and make itself felt. I don't think there was a lot to be gained for the Conservative Party in making those cuts, because in many ways it was a question that was almost irrelevant to their constituencies. I would say about anger more generally, that just as this is coming back, that I mean certainly anger is present, but the populism I think has to be thought about other attitudes to politics, particularly in a period of stagnant, 40, 45 years of not much improvement in the level of wages and living conditions. Certainly in Ontario, there's a lot of unhappy people. Aware of a greater marginalization, and David Holchinski's maps of Toronto, where he shows a move from a city with relatively egalitarian income distribution to ones where you have much more geographic dispersion between those who have and those who have not, and those who have not are in situations where they have to spend much more on things like transportation and so on. It leads to a politics, I think, where parties that offer very specific ways that your life could just be a bit easier succeed. And so for Doug Ford, there was a bit of anger, but I think a lot more of it was a kind of a strange sense of hope that if you elect me, nothing big will change for the negative, but maybe you'll have just a little more. And so in the Canadian case, I think one of the questions that's different in, say, the States is that you do have a party on the left that traditionally had also spoken to some of those constituencies with a different message that if you elect us, things could also, you'd get a little more, but through collective provision. And so one of the issues, I think, looking forward is in those communities, the NDP is a significantly weakened party, but how a left populism plays against a right one, not just at the level of anger, but also at how do you deal with the fact that people haven't gotten ahead in a long time and they see politics as part of the problem. So what is a strategy where politics would help people live better? It's maybe less present in our discussion.
Thank you. I'll go to Martin.
Yeah, thanks. I don't want to push too much on the populist button. I think we've already done that, but I'm still tempting to do it nonetheless. Listening to the panel, there's two narratives on populism going on, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just curious to see your reaction. There's the narrative that there's a general populism across the board in Canada that is fairly similar to the US, similar to other places in the world. But there's also, I hear in some of your interventions, specific brands of populism that are regionally based or provincially based or whatever. So I'm just wondering, is populism the same across the country, or is it many phenomena that are regionally based? And my kind of secondary question to that is, is there a market for someone like Mad Max to have a national kind of approach to populism in this respect?
Thank you. Who'd like to take that on? Jean-François?
Well, in Quebec, it was
Well, the populist of the Coalition Avenir Québec was clearly anti-elitist, defined, and this was the reason is very obvious because the CAQ was not a traditional governing party, so it was quite easy to say that Quebecers should vote for the CAQ because it's going to be different from les vieux partis. The gouvernance. So I think that the populism of the CAQ was first and foremost anti-elitist centered, which is an important component of populism. So that would be the very specific aspect of Quebec due to historical context.
And this will be our last question, so your final opportunity to jump in if you'd like.
I'd say in Ontario, it's a populist appeal that we saw rather than a kind of deeper ideology or movement of the sorts that Melanie spoke of before, which I think is a significant difference. But I think, as Richard points out, there are real questions about the opinion basis and how that plays against electoral strategy. And so there is, I think, space for a development of these kinds of appeals at the very least in elections, and so part of it has to do with partisan strategy, and I guess part of it too deals with a kind of broader political morality. Are there certain appeals that we see as being off the table? That maybe comes back a bit to some of this question of the treatment of minority language communities. I mean, is there an elite consensus that it's important to keep that out of politics, or do we see the instrumentalization of some of these divisions to win elections, but in a way that leaves us perhaps more divided? Thank you.
Richard or Melanie?
I don't find populism a very useful term most of the time. We tend to conflate a lot of stuff that's actually quite different. For example, the progressives of 1919, 2021 are a completely different operation from, say, social credit in 1935 or reform in the 90s. It's a very, to quote other academics, it's a very thin notion, populism is. There's some notion of betrayal by elites. Betrayal in what particular way, however, is quite context dependent. Many of the recent expressions of supposed populism, or the people cloaking themselves in the terminology of populism, is a revolt of comfortable people, more often than not of people who are in genuine distress, and that's much more true. What I just said is much more true of the 2016 election in the US than a lot of commentary concedes. The challenge that the country faces is a challenge that many countries face, in that it has become much more diverse, and the proportion of its population is much more foreign-born now than it was in the recent past, although it's not more foreign-born than it was 100 years ago. Right? Just proportionally speaking, those are the great decades of migration, and there is a kind of a rumble of a sense of dispossession out there, and the people who rumble the loudest about it are the ones who are the least dispossessed by it, because they tend not to live in places where immigrants actually are numerous. So it's there, and it doesn't take much to activate it, right? 4 Nigerians on the Manitoba border, and we've lost control of our borders. And so I think that you wonder why Bill Blair took so long to do the kind of obvious thing with the third country agreement, and they may not get it through Parliament, which probably the Scheer would prefer that they not do. And there is a worry, right? There's a lot of short-term residential exemptions in the United States that are about to evaporate, and the Trump administration will not renew them. So I think my guess would be that liberal strategists right now are deeply worried about the number of people who will turn up on the borders this summer, and I think Bill Blair really wants to get this bill through to try and neutralize that. So it's entirely possible that we will see it. But honestly, do I want to call that populism or xenophobia? I mean, it's not all xenophobia. That people have a right to feel dispossessed to an extent when they see kind of cultural norms changing in ways they don't understand. But it's there, and it will have an anti-elite dimension to the rhetoric, because there is an elite consensus around this stuff, which has been insensitive to the rank and file of the country. So the potential is definitely there. but it's going to be situationally specific if it gets activated, and it's got to have some to do anything other. Well, the real political damage could be done to the Conservative Party.
Thank you. Last word to Melanie.
Is it the same across the country, or is it a phenomenon that's regionally based? I think it's both. And this is where I would I would make a distinction between things that happened on the prairies in terms of political development in the early 20th century. And people like Jerry Boychuk are doing interesting work to see how populism links with things like the temperance movement and how that links to stuff like suffrage and how that's different from the plain states like the Dakotas and things like this. So, I mean, I see that as political development, and this expectation of anti-elitism and anti-intellectualism on the prairies kind of stems from that. And I think that's just kind of like a legacy of political development. That, I think, is just kind of important context to understand, say, politics in Alberta. And I think that is probably regionally specific, though I wouldn't claim that anti-elitism is like a prairie thing. Like, that is very much, like, you can see elements of that, but that's key to the political development of that particular part of the country. I take Dick's point well about whether or not we call some of this stuff populism. The point that I would circle back to is this idea that people for whom claims or catchphrases resonate, say the Barbaric Cultural Practices Hotline, or you don't hear this very often, but you do see phrases coming up places like make Canada great again, make Alberta great again, stuff like this. It's very small, but that is the sort of thing that strikes me as this ubiquitous undercurrent that that seems to be, like, if we're going to call that populism, taking the point well, that seems to me the thing that is going to be present in low levels, but is kind of there from coast to coast to coast. That doesn't seem to have as much of a geographically bounded political development, say, as some of the other things that we have historically in Canadian political science called populism.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panel.